Thank you. Nice to see everyone. We have been exploring this book, Profound Treasury, which is a compendium of talks and teachings culled from other sources, other books, and which in turn were culled from talks, edited by some incredibly brilliant people, some of whom may be right in this room. And thank you, John. And and the entire lineage of translators and teachers that brought this together. The common factor is the work of Chögyam Trungpa, who was John's direct teacher, art teacher, is that correct? Certainly my root teacher, the first teacher I came across that made me actually shudder. Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome. And I know that question, the question of teachers, teachings, is all being looked at again in our society. Lots of rugs being pulled out from those systems, questioning how really devotion to a teacher is appropriate in our society or not, and that kind of thing. For some of us, we can't imagine a compromise to that, however, except to say that a teacher leads you to the ultimate guru, which is yourself, your own mind, your own enlightened being. And ultimately, it's our intelligence, our critical, reasoning, questioning mind that keeps us awake and keeps us balanced along the way. In this tradition, as far as I understand, there's never a recommendation that one shuts off their critical intelligence to just follow along blindly. By the same token, a lot of us that have been in this system for a while have developed great devotion for our teachers, great respect for them. You have a question? You sure? Okay. Good. Please feel free to just jump in at any point. And if you disagree, please do so. Or look, we could have a debate. But the teachings, the way Trungpa taught them, often were ensconced in unconventional methods. He might have worn a cowboy shirt, smoked Marlboros, drank inexpensive beer out of cans while he was giving a talk at different times. But it's my understanding, please correct me, sir, if I'm wrong, that his actual rendering of the teachings was quite traditional. And I think that's something that gets missed in the approach sometimes. And he took these definitely and very specifically from root texts, the Treasury of Knowledge by Chögyam Control and Mipam Rinpoche's work and other works, that he actually didn't really deviate from the actual truth as he understood it in the teachings. What he did, brilliantly maybe, in my opinion, is position it, posit it, express it in a way that the people of his time could understand it. So it made direct sense. There's different levels of teaching depending on the diverse aspirations and capabilities of the students and the community and the time. So, some teachings are very fundamental and rely specifically on a given quote-unquote word, doctrine, something carved in stone perhaps. Some are a little more experiential and developmental, and there always seems to be a third level, whether it's in Christianity, Judaism, and Buddhism. When you have the fundamental, then you have a more kind of experiential, maybe heart-oriented, open rendering of the teaching. And then every major school of religious thought also has a mystical level. A level where people are actually involved in experiencing directly the teachings, not interpreting them through their mind. And that's a very subtle thing, because we could be misinterpreting the teachings, or we could be actually experiencing them directly. So the language that Trungpa Rinpoche uses is really brilliant, because it starts to point to this. In our exploration of the Four Noble Truths, we're now in the introduction to the path, the Eightfold Path. And he's talking about what's a basic staple of the Hinayana, or foundational teachings, the traditional teachings. But he's talking about it with language that's quite remarkable. He's saying that we can develop dignity on the path. Now, that's quite different than having a humble attitude. Now, he did recommend his students adopt a sense of meekness and a sense of humbleness, of course, a sense of deflating their own arrogance, their own ego acquisition, and all of that. But there is also a sense that the actual progress along the path happens when we sit up straight, tuck in our shirt. I just said that because I just did that before I got up here from the south. And I thought I better tuck it in. I don't know why. But there is something that makes me feel like I respect you more if I do that. Another teacher might be up here with his shirt hanging out, and that could be fine, totally fine. Finding a different way to dignity. But the idea that we would just flop and talk all about our neurosis and the difficulty we have with waking up and how defeatist our point of view might be doesn't really translate in a way that actually helps people, I don't think. But if we actually take the, courageous step to say, this is my experience, I am actually on the path. I'm not just talking about the path. I'm not just assuming I'll get on the path someday. And I'm not doing what a lot of people in our culture do, particularly in other traditions. In my family, a very Catholic thing, to assume that the church is happening somewhere else, And you go to church and you absolve your sins and you take care of all of that and you talk to God, and then you leave it be and close the door, and then you go out and sin, covet, and do all the things that you really want to do. And I've always felt like it's that much more appealing to people when it's bad, when they're breaking rules a little bit. And then they can go back to their church or synagogue or place of practice or worship and make it all better, and then start the process over. In our tradition, the path is about our direct experience, and actually there is no time off. Have you ever heard that story that somebody asked Trungpa Rinpoche, do you ever take a vacation?
No.
His answer, Jane?
I think something like there wasn't one, or
No.
vacation from what?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Vacation from what?
Mm-hmm.
That actually in the spiritual path, it's a 24/7 operation. We're always here, we're always awake, or we're not. And that toggle, that moment of decision, that choice is always ours to make. So when we enter in the discussion from his point of view of the path, we're not just studying a traditional teaching, we're actually looking at how we have entered the path ourselves, or not. Or, if you're like me, sometimes I have one foot on it and one foot out of it. And that doesn't serve me at all, The path seems to be calling us to put in both feet and be there completely and fully. And that's very different than theistic traditions that say you're doing this to be good or to go to heaven, right? Even fundamentalist to Buddhist traditions posit the idea that nirvana is an end game to this path, And that's the extinguishing of all suffering. Is that correct? There have been later developments in Buddhism, and that suggests that perhaps nirvana is an experience that's happening right now and informs our experience of samsara. And that the two don't have to be separated out, and we don't certainly have to expunge one completely. There seems to be some evidence that samsara, the cycle, addictive cycle of suffering that's continued since beginningless time, has been going on for quite a while. So it's redundant. If it's since beginningless time, it must have been a while. And that it will continue apace, as long as humans have this idea that they're separate from everything else, and that they have to get a little more than everything else, and that they don't live in concert, in connection to everything in the universe. They believe they're the special ones, the chosen ones, the only ones. And so we have to work a little harder to get what we want and what we need. And this causes great suffering in the world. And when the Buddha woke up, when he became the Buddha, or the awakened one, this is what he saw. He saw the vastness, the interconnectedness of the suffering of our existence altogether. Samsara, this endless cycle of suffering. He didn't immediately say, well, let's get rid of that. I think the first step is to look at it and admit it. This has taken to great effect, I said this last time I taught, in the 12-step programs. Because the first step is to admit you have a problem, which is interesting. If none of you have done the actual program, I did it and failed. But I learned a great deal, enormous great deal. It was the most important thing I think I have done, one of the most important things, outside of the Buddhist path, my Buddhist teachings. And, but what it became for me is an understanding of the woundedness, the neurosis, the difficulties that manifested as indulgence in drinking, and at one time in my life, drugs. Right? So actually seeing that, it became more of a path to me beginning to understand my mind, but their methodology, not unlike the methodology of the Buddha, is to start by saying, this is the problem, and look at it. And not like, this is a problem I can just shrug off. In 12-step parlance, they say, I'm powerless over this situation. In Buddhism, we say, samsara is endless. It's existed forever, and will apparently exist forever, or as long as there is an ever to exist in. And to actually look at it and to begin to say, this causes great suffering, and pain is part of life, is a phenomenally important step, especially in our experience in the modern world, where we could shrug off pain very easily. We can outrun it. We could text it away. We could take any number of drugs to moderate our sense of being, so we never have to feel any sharp edges in our life. We could just float through life in some beautiful way with a lot of cotton batting. Trungpa Rinpoche actually likened that to being in a cocoon, literally, where we would ensconce ourselves, and he believed even our concepts, not necessarily even pharmaceutical drugs, but just our concepts and our ideas that keep us from direct contact with our life. We're separated from everything, so we don't have to feel pain or suffering. But if we admit that there's pain in the world, we could actually look at the cause of that pain. And I think this is what you've been studying and looking at, probably a lot more in greater detail than I'm rendering it. But as a ramp up to the path, we see the truth of suffering. We then can look at what causes that, or how we perpetuate it, right? How we're implicated in it. If there's suffering in your life, some of it is inherited, and some of it has come to you, and some of it is natural for humans. but a lot of it might be generated by us. And if for no other reason, simply because we wish it wasn't there, or we misunderstand it, we think things are suffering that are actually not. I believe I'm suffering right now because I moved to New Jersey from New Mexico. I can't even grasp the difference in the quality of my life. And that one cost me a fraction of what I'm paying now to be in a really difficult, aggressive, and unhealthy, actually, environment. But all I need to do is step back a little bit, just a little bit, and look at the bigger picture, and my life is really golden compared to many and much, you know? And that's so much the fallacy of our culture. We have so much that we could hope for or dream about, that the things that we actually have, the blessings we have, are seen as, you know, trials, seen completely negative. This causes suffering that doesn't even need to be there. And every time somebody with a nicer car comes by, and somebody a little thinner, and that's what I love about New York. There's always going to be somebody who can make you feel poverty-stricken, you know? And the opposite is also true. But it's interesting how selective we are, how we don't look at those people that are suffering more than we are, perhaps, and think how lucky we are. We rarely do that. But we look at people who are suffering less than we are from our point of view and wish we were there, fall into this envy. And when I say we, I'm not talking about any of you, of course. I'm just talking about human tendencies and all of that. And we're all here on the path because we're trying to not buy that, not fall for that, not fall for that game, right? So if we could start to look at how we are implicated in that suffering, how we create that suffering, how we cause that suffering, then we could begin to maybe try to extricate ourselves from it. And the cessation of suffering, and I did the introduction to that 3 weeks ago, and he very brilliantly, in my opinion, and I'll stop being a fanboy now. You know, it's great. He was the superhero. Well, you can feel whatever you feel about Trungpa. It doesn't matter. The teachings actually are at the core of things, not the person or the personality. But I love the way he suggested that the cessation of suffering isn't necessarily an end game. It's not like, oh, it's all over someday and I'll be in this complete world of peace. And I think that's what many people believe inside. And maybe that's the way they've transferred their belief in heaven, you know? This like place that's really endlessly beautiful and perfect. I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people that live in New York in particular would find that very boring. Not very peaceful, ultimately. I mean, I think after the first few millennia, I'd get kind of sick of art music. Ultimately, what would it mean to be free of suffering? Would it mean that we would have no life, no world, no truth? And those are philosophical questions that could be debated, but in the tradition that Trungpa spoke from, he was talking about how the cessation of suffering is happening all the time. There are gaps. It's not wall to wall unless we're in a hell realm of sorts. If we're in certain environments where there is no gap or space. And there are people born in those situations, and there are those situations happening in our life. But mostly, the vast majority of those situations are perception. We perceive there's no gap because we don't know what a gap is. We don't know how to stop or pause. Have you ever had the experience, we talked about this last week, I guess, or last time I spoke, but of having broken up with somebody or been fired or somebody dies, and it's really heavy and it hurts? And then have you ever had the experience that you wake up one day and you've forgotten about it and you're sort of fine until you remember? And you're like, oh yeah, that's right, she broke up with me. I've got to feel crappy again, right? And we go back to that because we have to. You know, I lost my mother a year and a half ago, and My poor sister is still suffering over it. And I am too. I'm sad and broken. But I embrace and open my heart to all the gaps that there could be, all the places where there isn't pain in them. My poor sister, she's a wonderful woman, but she feels guilty. She feels like she's letting down the side or the cause whenever she relaxes. It feels okay. You know? Like she has to carry that weight around with her. The cessation of suffering is something that becomes apparent to us when we're on the path. We actually begin to see that as we develop and as we go more and more. There's an analogy that I sometimes use that I have a feeling will be completely inapplicable in this environment, but it's about American football. And, do you follow a little bit? Yeah, so there was a big paradigm shift 10 years ago, 15 years ago maybe, where it became clear that for running backs, the people that ran the ball, to actually not run into each other, but to find space, and to actually design whole offenses that created space. Does that make sense? That spread the defenses out so that people, and they talk about it now, not running backs having great power, which used to be back in the day, but great vision. That they have this vision. I definitely am not going to go any further with the analogy and try to convince you that American football is an enlightened activity. But it's just kind of pretty natural that we're evolving toward this idea that we could actually go toward the space in things. If you've ever run through Union Square or, you know, in the subways at rush hour, you know how it is. If you're not trying and you just find your way through the space, it works. And then do you ever like just look up and catch somebody's eye and then all of a sudden you're bumping into people, right? Or you start thinking about it and think, I have to go this way, and then it becomes impossible. But finding the space and the flow of things. And this is, to me, sounds like what he's talking about in terms of entering the path. It's not, he says, a preset set of circumstances and conditions. Some people see it that way, and some schools probably teach it that way. But from his point of view, much more experiential, he seemed to say that dignity, holding our seat and keeping our balance, and entering into the flow of our practice and our path in our life, heading toward the gaps, toward the cessation and away of the conflict and controversy, but more toward the openness of our experience, would actually then lead us down the path. He likened it to traveling through the jungle. There's no set particular way to go through the jungle. It's different for everybody. I wrote a little note to myself, DIY, in the corners. Anybody know what that is? That's also kind of a age cultural thing. It was very much the manifesto of the punk movement in the 70s and 80s, where they were trying to get away from everything being perfect and pristine, and just, you could make your own music. You can do it. You don't have to have a contract. You don't have to have an obligation to a manager or management. You could just sing. You could just do it. Well, in the same way here, Trungpa is telling us that we actually don't have to have this preconceived idea of how to travel on the path, but we have to do it, you, individually. And actually I'm pointing you out, because if you could do it for all of us, that would be a lot easier. Just let us know how it goes. No, you could point to all of us, right? Because you have to do it too. And you'll do it quite differently than I'll do it. Some people will be really elegant when they do it, like he suggested. I've managed to bump into every possible thing. I've had a very uneasy time on the path, and created a few bruises and scars, some, demolition along the way. But some people have a simpler approach to things, but we all learn. And some of us need to learn hard. and some people pick it up more quickly. But to be able to compare ourselves to anyone else makes no sense at all. It made sense to the religious systems I grew up with, but that's what we did. You donated more money and you moved up in the church and you acted kinder and nicer in public, regardless of what was happening in your home, right? And you kind of moved up, and it became a social strata, a way of, seeing yourself on the path, getting closer and closer to God. Now, we're Buddhist, and we're told there is no God. Where are we going to go now? Right? One thing he was talking about very much when he said dignity, and that dignity is an operative thing in terms of following the path. I think that's a very much a kind of a Tibetan Buddhist approach, a very much a Trungpa approach, if you don't mind me saying so. That there's a sense that we could, he used to say, hitch up your chuba. That's the ceremonial dress, that Tibetans would wear. That kind of hitch up your chuba and face forward and smile and cheer up. That was essential, and not creating more problems and looking at the difficulties in life, but actually beginning to have some self-respect on the path. As you continue along the path, there are some signposts. And, if my memory is better, I'd be able to ramble them right off, but I'm going to read them to you. The first thing he talked about that we notice as we go into the path, which I've already talked about, are the 4 marks of existence. You're familiar with that? 4 fundamental experiences that all humans have when they begin to wake up. Well, they have them whether they're awake or not, but you begin to see them, right? You begin to see impermanence. And what he said about impermanence is that when we're on the path, when we're not on the path, we see impermanence, but we either ignore it, or we shunt it, or push it away, or we try to fix it, or we think we'll be able to get around it somehow, right? But if we're on the path, we actually see that we could benefit from the idea of impermanence, because impermanence sort of cuts the idea of eternalism, that there is an end game of complete peace, that the Buddhist teachings are the greatest and the most amazing in the whole world, that we are sinners forever and will never, ever change. Anything that lasts forever in our mind, or that we believe lasts forever, falls into this category called eternalism, and that's considered to be one of the main pitfalls. One of the main places that you're not on the path. I think that we all, if we enter the Buddhist path, bite that first bullet and say, okay, everything changes. Everything falls apart. Everything falls away. Can we accept that? But do we really? And so that becomes the real kind of question. Does that make sense? Because is there somewhere inside? I teach sometimes with not younger people in age, although I'd like to and hope to do more of that since I'm here, but people that are beginning on the path. And I just had a meeting with a student, and he's an older guy, drives a car, like a cab driver, but private service. He's kind of real New York guy. And he keeps using the word should. Well, as a Buddhist, shouldn't I, with this like heavy pressure over things like there is an all-encompassing, doctrine of something that he has to live up to. And what we're learning here about the path is there's a map. A map is not an all-encompassing doctrine. It's recommendations, places you could go, things you could see, pitfalls you could maybe avoid to make your traverse easier. Does that make sense? We had a fun time today, our meeting actually, because every time he said should, I would go should. And it was great. It was kind of cool to kind of wake up and see, for him, but also for me, because I do it too, these ideas in our head that are pretty solid, that we actually assume have always been there and will always be there. Impermanence, affects everything in our experience. And because of that, we could actually disabuse ourselves of the idea that we could hold on to really anything. Step 2, the second mark of existence is suffering. Once we accept that everything changes, we could realize that we're also always trying to hold on, and that holding on creates a friction between what's real, a cognitive dissonance, if you will, spiritual dissonance perhaps, between what's actually happening, the dissolution, the change, the movement of things, and our tendency to want to nail them down and make them about me. Me, me, me. And that creates suffering. And that suffering, though, if we try to avoid it and get away from it, that's not really on the path. But if we enter the path, we can actually realize that the very suffering can help us loosen our grip on attachment. That because we're going to suffer, we don't have to romanticize our relationship, because no matter how wonderful that person is, they're going to be jerks sometimes. And they're going to make our life really hard sometimes. And it's not going to be eternalistic, right? It's not going to be one thing. It's going to be developmental. So this suffering, the fact that actually love hurts, the fact that life hurts, kind of can keep us from gaining attachment. Now, the other marks of existence, I want to move more quickly, are emptiness and egolessness, like other and self. So, on some level, emptiness is the idea of the cessation of suffering, the gap. But if it's also subject to the other two things, that there is suffering and that there is impermanence, then emptiness is necessarily only a momentary experience. It's a sense of things that we could move through on the path. That actually things don't mean, they don't have the significance which we put them on. There isn't the weight and the heaviness attached to everything. But the things are still there. And if we begin to see that on the path, at some point in the path, we stop making it about us. Does that make sense? We start actually experiencing that, what is there, what's actually happening in the landscape, in reality, with other people. Stop trying to influence the game, trying to get them to believe in a certain way that we think is going to make us happy. So the path seems to be motivated by a certain revulsion. That's a basic tenet, Buddhist tenet, right? That we gain a certain revulsion with the suffering that we cause ourselves and others. So we want to go on to the path. But it seems to me that it's driven by this process of letting go. That we begin to travel and let go of everything we see. All of our attainment, all of the wonderful things that we see on the path, all the ways that we get better than somebody else. Let that go, because we're not, right? All the ways that we berate ourselves because we'll never be as good as John Baker. Let that go, right? John Baker will never be as good as a Buddha. Who knows? Because none of us met the Buddha, and none of us really know John Baker any more than we know anybody else. So all of us have to determine the path and develop along the path as we do, and all of us are subject to holding on, and holding on retards our process in the path. So the actual motivator of the path is to let go. If the motivator was to move forward, then we'd be grasping, right? And that grasping would be subject to change and to degradation, and to ultimately bring us more suffering. All we can do is let go. Now, there are paths of accumulation, and we'll study that down the line, right? I imagine after the Eightfold Path, that's in the Mahayana view, that there are other paths and ways that we actually can move forward on the path. But the beginning, entering into the path, is some sense of turning our back on the suffering that we've created and being willing to look directly at that and start to move toward its cessation, toward the openness, toward the space. And that can't happen if we're holding on and comparing and making a big deal of our path. There are 4 qualities of the path. I'll just mention them. One is suchness, that the basic fundamental element of the path, whether we notice this or not, is the connection to the contact with things as they are. Not what we think, not what we imagine, but that everything in life is as it is. And that's quite beautiful and quite perfect. And that dissonance that we create in our mind, that thinking it should be different than that, or more significant than that, or mean more than simply it being what it is, actually creates a lot of problems and kind of means maybe we're not on the path, or we're, putting up roadblocks to the path. But to actually fundamentally move in a direction where we begin to accept what is there and not our interpretation and our wishful thinking of our spin, but that we actually begin to just see what is there. The second is, if we're willing to do that, and we can continue to let go and move forward, we start to develop insight. I'm sure you've covered this at some point, but insight, usually when he's referring to it, he's talking about wisdom that seems to come to us, or seems to be extra, from our cognitive frontal lobe thinking and figuring, that there seems to be this sense of when we relax and open, the clouds part a little bit, sunlight comes through, and there's a sense that we understand something. That this insight begins to develop along the path. We begin to see things not in a figured out cognitive way as much as an intuitive sense of just knowing. That becomes more and more apparent, like the running backs running toward the gaps in space, right? Practice is the third quality of the path, unfortunately. It takes this manual work of bringing ourselves back to the present, especially because we are not trained to do that in our culture. We're trained to do anything but. To actually bring ourselves back, it's like a scythe, if you will. I think there's probably a scientific postulate, I'm spacing it out, Pascal's wager? No, it's something where you're constantly coming back to the simplest, most direct reasoning, right? Occam's razor. You're actually coming back to the simplest, most direct experience and eschewing a sense of complication that this practice is bringing us back to now, okay? And the last part is fruition. The fruition of the path is nirvana. It's completely opposite of everything I said earlier. And that is kind of like, and I think I could leave it there because I think that could be a bit of a discussion. So if nirvana or enlightenment, I don't know that they're synonymous, but I think one way you could look at the idea of enlightenment is it's the end game of the path, right? That's what we want on a level. A stabilized experience of clarity and compassion. Is that nirvana? Or is nirvana really the absence of all struggle and all difficulty? That's not what Trungpa is suggesting in the reading for today. But maybe what he's suggesting is simply that we change our allegiance from the struggle to the space. Doesn't mean we get rid of all the struggle. It doesn't mean that we can't occasionally fall back, but that our allegiance is on the space, the openness, the clarity, the compassion. And that all the neurosis that we create can be seen as complications to the path. And then we bring back the practice and come back to that razor and bring us back to the present. Would anybody care to talk about this? I am fascinated with this idea, though, that different Buddhist schools kind of tend to rub against this issue a little bit. The end game of there being a complete, unboilable nirvana, emptiness, a bubble of complete peace, and the idea that nirvana and samsara are actually the same thing. So what do you think?
That's actually what I was just going to add. That I find that idea very profound. That samsara and nirvana are inseparable. It's just so rich in meaning. It's totally changed my shift. It's totally shifted how I progress along the path. I don't think nirvana any longer is like some blissful state. It's just experiencing things as they are. My current experience is samsara, then that is nirvana.
So could I say, I'm putting words in your mouth. Tell me if they're not accurate. Are you saying maybe that it's a question of waking up? Like paying attention and being present or not? Like if you're present with the suffering, then it's that nirvana. And even if you're in Kauai on the beach and you're not present, right?
Yes.
Because of multiple Mai Tais.
Yes, and also it's just dropping the idea of having a goal and being content with what is. I think the battery must be going in this thing.
Mm-hmm. It was good. I heard you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could just leave
It's
it
not
on.
staying on.
It's always it's not staying.
Yeah, it's going off immediately.
So maybe is that an indication of this impermanence we've been hearing about?
I think so.
That it just wants to sustain it's on this. What do you think about this nirvana business?
I'm inclined to see it as encouraging because I think the version of Buddhism I was not taught but heard about when I was a little kid seems really, really difficult. Like this ultimate enlightenment and bliss all the time seems like very intimidating to me. But if I got a flash of insight once a month, just a flash, and then I got a flash once a week, that would seem encouraging. Maybe I could, after some decades of practice, I could get a flash every day, just a flash.
Yeah.
But that would still be progress. So that's really interesting. But
Yeah.
I also think that there's a compassion element that we'll come to later that's not as strong in the Hinayana path. But sometimes when I see my work situation differently in a way that seems to involve more openness and less struggle, it's helpful. But when I'm interacting with my coworkers that haven't gained any insight into their situation, I'm disinclined to think poorly of them because I see myself in them very, very recently. But then interacting with them can be a challenge because it's like, why can't you people just get over that? It's so obvious, except that it's not obvious to you, except we're all trapped in this together, and I'm not going to inflict my insight on you, but it's like, it's hard for me to figure out how to work with that dynamic. I'm not judging people, I'm just saying I can see that you people are right where I was 10 minutes ago, and I'd like to bring them along, but I can't.
That would be helpful too when people are really
It would.
stuck.
Yeah.
To just tell them, "Oh, I used to be that way."
Yeah, and it's not to improve them. It's not like they're not fine just the way they are. But the suffering, being submerged in their suffering with them, can be a really bad day.
Yeah.
Not always, but it can be.
But there seems to be this enormous value in stepping back and seeing the process.
No question. I didn't mean to.
Oh no! I felt like you were there too. But I'm just kind of bringing your points together, that there is this incredible heartbreak when you see people complicating their lives and doing things that are completely unnecessary. And sometimes those people are ourselves,
Yeah, and it's difficult, for me, perhaps not for you, but to find a way to talk about these things that doesn't involve blaming the victim. So I can see where I've caused my own suffering. I can see a person who may or may not be in similar circumstances, and to have a conversation about it that can help them have an alternate view. So, right, I'm not telling you how to think. I might be giving you a second option that you didn't have, and then letting you decide whether you like option A or option B without blaming the victim, because that's not helpful.
Thank you for saying possibly not me. All I've really learned is just not to hit send right away. Does that make sense? But
those gaps are also useful.
I have to say, so many times I've lashed out at people in my head, or even with my thumb, and then went, wait, can I rephrase that? Wait, can I rephrase that? And then, interestingly, to me, it becomes a question of effectiveness. And I think that compassion sometimes is given this big compassion is about love and hugging,
the hallmark version,
paying, and giving up and stuff like that. But sometimes compassion is, I think, being effective. Knowing that what I say is going to register with you. Does that make sense? As opposed to what I say is going to impress you or piss you off.
Or that matters.
Or that's
worth saying. Maybe it's difficult to say, but it's worth it in the end.
Yeah. You must see that a lot, right? In your administering. Jane is administering a website, Facebook group, which is presiding over the dissolution of this once glorious symbolic kingdom, and is now breaking down into a lot of, factionalism and aggression. But you've seen how with that there are times when you could increase the aggression or decrease the aggression and create space, right? Do you have anything to add about that?
Mostly I just don't comment at all. That seems like that's 90% of the best answer I've ever come up with is just don't comment, don't say anything. As soon as I start having an opinion of my own, it falls apart very rapidly and becomes fighting. People will fight on their own without me, but if I have an opinion, then it's almost hopeless for me to
That's interesting. What is your experience of nirvana, samsara, or anything else you'd like to talk about?
To be in samsara is part of our path. We gotta be millions of times here to become outer Buddha. This is my goal. After maybe billions of years, I believe I became a baby. In another galaxy or in another planet, everybody wanna be himself.
Everybody's going to be
Buddha.
Yeah.
We are.
Okay, so please.
I think that we are already, Buddha nature is in us already. So we just have to find it or uncover it. But what I find very difficult and challenging on the path is in daily life. So 2 weeks ago, I went to this retreat which John led in Westchester with other teachers, and we meditated there for 8-10 hours a day, and it was really helpful. But after that, I find it so difficult to stay on the path in a regular life, when I don't meditate that much or I don't meditate at all. Like there are some days when I don't have time. So I was just thinking maybe, like it's so difficult. Maybe I just have to go somewhere and just meditate all the time to keep up with this path, So because you're so busy all the time. There's so many things around you. There are so many things which upset you, and you don't have time to. I don't know. Like for me, I find it's like very, very challenging. Yeah, what's your suggestion? If you're not in the retreat, so how?
Keep doing it. And keep doing it. How long have you been meditating?
More than a year.
Mm-hmm.
A year and a half, I think.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about it in a way that makes it sound like you get it. You know what you're doing to some extent. So now the next step is to stabilize that more and more in life, right?
Yeah.
Do more retreats. But always come back to life, maybe, if you want my recommendation. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. But that's the way it was set up in the schools that I studied with, that if you became a nun or a monk in a way that's easier, that sounds challenging, but it's actually, once you get used to it, that becomes your life.
Right.
But to actually go into deep retreat and then come back and have to live in this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That eventually samsara and nirvana get to be seen as one thing. If you were to look at samsara as an experience of solidity or not clarity, confusion, tension, aggression, right? These are all things you maybe could look at it that way. I'm sure it's a bigger picture, but that's one way to look at it internally. And nirvana as an experience of openness and peace and space. We've all had both of those experiences. My feeling is if we start to develop our awareness, that they start to fuse in our mind a little bit. That even when there's a period of space, we know we're going to die, and there's a heartbreak involved in it. And if there's experience of complete aggression and anger, we know it won't last. And so we can kind of let go of it a little bit. And it seems like this depiction of the path is this idea, and he'll get, and you'll get in subsequent classes, more specific about the Eightfold Path and what each of those things mean. But this is a general idea of continually letting go. And it seems to me that even though we're moving toward the space and the openness, we have to let go of that too, right? So if you come back from retreat and go, that was great and this is terrible, that's kind of not exactly right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because the baseline of the path, as we talked about, is suchness, is things simply as they are, right? Mm-hmm. So on retreat, it's beautiful. You're in the cradle of love and kindness, of state, this beautiful area, and John teaching, and these teachers supporting that whole thing. That's beautiful. And down here, there's traffic, there's annoyance, there's aggravation, there's the smell of urine, there's everything, right? And it's beautiful too, maybe, because it is what it is. And at some point, I think these things become combined a little bit in our experience.